AJ, welcome to the Tales of Leadership podcast, brother. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm well. Thank you so much for having me, Jeff.
Yeah. So, a great place to always start is just take the time to provide who you are to our listeners.
Most of my time is spent either working with school districts around effective leadership at the senior level and the governance level, or working with school systems around discipline and behavior at the school building level.
I, I love the concept is that you're in the academic arena, right? And you're helping build schools and then also developing young leaders. A lot of the guests that I've had on Tales Leadership are, senior level military leaders, junior level military leaders, but I have never had anyone yet that's in that academic arena. So I'm really curious of how you define leadership, and that's one of the first questions I love asking. But also, how has that changed over the years as you started going down and discovering?
Yeah, so the classic expectation of leadership, as I've learned it, is that leaders are the folks who do the work.
Hmm.
And so if you're looking for people who are in that leadership role, what you're really looking for is who are people who are rolling up their sleeves and being of service and supporting the entire team at being the best version of itself. If you've got folks who are sitting off, aloof, and aren't involved in the work, that doesn't match my definition of leadership.
Yeah, the key thing there, and I love it, is that you have to be switched on. Leaders have to be switched on. I had a battalion commander tell me that whenever we would mentally get ready to go do, a training exercise or an operational exercise, he's like, "All right, it's time to switch on." You had to be turned on, and if you're not, you miss things. And as a leader, that's one of the most critical elements of being in the operational environment, both mentally and physically. So, kind of walk me through what drove you to the education field to start this in the first place.
Well, a lot of this was mostly born out of necessity and trying to figure out how to support the needs in my own household.
Hmm.
And then from that, just being called into action increasingly, both as a parent and as a community member, getting receiving more and more tasks from a community of folks who were in a lot of similar struggles as me, and trying to figure out how to be of service, again, both in my own household, but then also to the folks around me.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of really, so to get to where you are now in your leadership journey, and the books that you've been a part of, and the book that you just released. There's a lot of great stories I think that will really help kind of lead up to that. And if you're okay with sharing, I would love to kind of know what was some of the adversities that you've had to walk through, especially at a young age till to now, that's really galvanized AJ, like really set you on this path.
The the moment you asked that, the first thing that actually came to mind was the time when I nearly quit. I had
Mm,
recently been elected to the school board and I was serving in that capacity, but it wasn't at all going the way I expected. I don't know what type of fantasy land I was living in when I ran for the school board, but it was decidedly not that once I was on the school board. And the difference between my expectations and the reality were so extreme that I actually tried to quit and just leave my leadership post 6 months after stepping into it. And so I went to some of my elders and who had worked really hard to support me getting elected to the school board and let them know, hey, this is not what I expected. I'm not able to have the impact on children that I intended to have. And so, I'm going to go ahead and resign and let somebody else. And they promptly let me know that they did not put in all of that work to get me elected for me to punk out and
mm,
in the middle of my duty, and that I needed to come up with a different plan, and that if things weren't working, that I needed to pivot, but that quitting was not an option. That got me turned around. Fortunately, I had some folks in my life who were able to speak that truth and clarify the lack of character that was giving rise to this desire to quit was an unacceptable condition, and I needed to come up with another way to win. And so I did. But that's an example of a moment when I just became so frustrated and so not being able to see what success, not being able to see what victory for children might actually look like, that in a moment of weakness, I was interested in just walking away and taking what in reflection feels more like the cowardly way out. Um, but I think one of the things that allows leaders to be effective is they surround themselves with people who are stronger than they are in the moments when the leader is not strong. And fortunately, I had people who were strong enough in my moment of weakness that they put me back on the path. And so I submit to you that there are plenty of examples of like that along my journey where I was not yet the leader that my students needed me to be. And it was
Mm.
really through the coaching and the support and the cajoling of folks that I had the privilege of being surrounded with that I was able to persevere and move beyond that and ultimately to be effective.
So that right there just tells me everything I need to know about you is that you identified in a good way that you weren't the leader that your students needed you to be, but you identified that, and instead of giving in, you continued to push through and improve yourself. And we've all had those moments of weaknesses. I remember in the Army, and if anyone's listening to this, I'm sure your brother too, when he was in the Marine Corps, had these thoughts. It's like, I'm done. I quit.
So,
I throw it in the towel. But having people around you, and I call them accountability trees, people who are just deeply rooted, unwilling to listen to your
yes,
excuses,
yes, yes,
but also provide you shade in tough times. And you have to have those people in your corner because life is going to get a vote. We say in the military, the
yeah,
enemy always gets a vote, no matter
yep,
how well the plan was that you thought was planned out. When
mhm,
you hit execution button, it's going to change. And
yep,
there's a quote by Kyle wrote that I wrote down is there is no doubt in my mind that there are many ways to be a winner, but there's really only one way to be a loser, and that is to fail and to not look beyond that failure. And when you hit that moment, like a low point, you
yeah.
identified it and then you continue to move forward. And that's a mark of a true transformational servant leader.
No, I appreciate what you say about accountability trees. I've never heard that concept, but I really, really appreciate that, and especially the way you described it. The people who are unwilling to put up with who I'm being in the moment, and instead who are standing for the greatness that they see within me, even though that's not what I'm currently expressing. And I suspect, when I think about education, I think every child fails at some point. Like,
Mhm.
I've yet to meet anyone who has lived a life of perfection, that every child is going to stumble and fall at some point. And the real test of the education system is how do we respond in that moment? When the child stumbles, do we see that as
Wow.
an amazing opportunity for their greatness to be made manifest, for them to really grow and learn, and for their aspirations to, for the first full time, see the full brightness of their capacity? Or as a school system, when children stumble, do we take it upon ourselves to point fingers and cast aspersions, say, "Look, I told you, little AJ really didn't want to learn. I told you that he really
Yeah.
doesn't have it within him, and we should probably just find a way to get him out of here." Like that's a real differentiating factor. Our school system is going to be places where children learn and grow through and because of adversity and tribulation, or are they places where if children stumble, um, there aren't going to be adults, there's not going to be a sufficient safety net to pick them back up? And so this idea of having accountability trees that they provide that stability, um, um, I really enjoy that idea.
Yeah. There's a concept that I've had throughout my military career, and it's called a failure quote. So essentially, you have a total number of failures that you're allowed to have kind of in a
Mhm.
day. And I love that kind of idea of when you're going in through school, and I'm thinking of my daughter right now because she's such an analytical person. There's always steps to everything, and she has to do it the right way. And if she doesn't do it the right way the first way, then she just sees it as a failure, this insurmountable object that can never be moved because that moment in time she's failed. And that is what you just said is very, 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 very important, and that's hard to do a mindset shift within young children, that these are their informative years, and I've always said this before, is that our thoughts shape our beliefs shape our actions, and our action defines our legacy over time. You're in that amazing space in a young child's life of where they are shaping their beliefs, their core
Mhm.
values, their principles that are going to guide them to be a productive and successful adult. And learning to teach and cope with failure is challenging. So I'm curious from your standpoint, as a subject matter expert in the education field, how have you done that, and how is the school system doing that or failing to do that?
I was visiting a school earlier this week, and one of the things that the students said is that here at this school, we believe that school is adult practice. And so every time we mess up, our teachers see that as an amazing opportunity for us to practice being adults.
I
And
love it.
it is celebrated as, we're held accountable for whatever mess we made. You can be certain we're going to have to clean that mess up. And we're going to be responsible for
Mm,
repairing whatever harm we created. But that's because that's what's expected of adults, not because it's some type of punishment, but because fixing the things that you broke is what adults do. This is adults practice. And people aren't going to, the teachers in our building aren't going to look down on us because we made a mistake. They're going to be like, all right, it's learning time. It's about time. We've been waiting for a learning opportunity this whole day. And that celebration of students making mistakes, that doesn't happen by accident. That's a cultural phenomenon.
yeah.
The building leader for that particular school, Nathan, he's pretty adamant that this is the only acceptable response out of the adults in that building. That is cultural leadership that he has
Mm,
imposed in that school, and that's really the difference maker. Either you have leaders who see these moments of stumble as an opportunity for growth. As often said in the church, a setback is a setup for a comeback. Like either
yeah, I love that.
we're going to see it as that, or we're going to punish children for imperfection, which just doesn't make any sense.
I'm writing that down. Could you say that one more time?
I said a setback is a setup for a comeback.
Yeah, I love that. I've never heard that before. But there's another concept that is true to leaders, regardless of where you are, is that we have responsibilities. And I think as students, as teachers, as a soldier, as a father, as a husband, we all have responsibilities, the duties and titles that kind of come along with that label that defines us in that season of life. But when we fail to live up to those responsibilities, then we have to be held accountable. Um, and I truly
Right.
believe, like, now in today's society, that's where we're failing. We're failing to hold people accountable, and because of it, they're not learning. And what they are learning, I think, is developing a weaker mindset, and at the end of the day, a less resilient person. Because failure is inevitable.
Mhm.
Everyone's going to fail. I think what David Ramsey has a quote that, and I'm not going to say it verbatim, but all of these people that we see at the top of the mountain, what you don't know is that that was incremental failure that they continued to stack up until they got to the top of the mountain. And when you realize that, that becomes powerful. So adult practice. I love that.
Well, this is one of the things that I work a lot at with schools. I've got a group of high schools I'm working with right now that comes to mind, where one of the things that I'm doing is helping them deploy student-led restorative practices. And so the basic concept here is that when little AJ and little Joshua get into it, and we're behaving the way we're not supposed to be behaving, instead of us going to the assistant principal's office and the assistant principal figuring out what is a suspension that needs to be handed out. Instead, we go to a group of our peers who've been specifically trained, and they lead us through a process that they've been
Mm,
trained to lead, that has the two of us examine, what is the harm that we've created, both for each other and for ourselves, but also what's the harm that we've created for our learning environment, for the larger community of learners. Because this happened in the middle of a school, it was probably disruptive, but that's not even the most debilitating harm. Some of the most debilitating harm, from the fact that we were pushing and shoving and hitting or whatever, is there are other children in the school who maybe they're wondering, is this a safe place for me? Am I going to get pushed and shoved? And am I going to get hit next? And so now,
yeah.
instead of thinking about the stuff that I'm here to learn and being joyful about my studies, I spend a little bit of energy on that, and a little bit of energy looking over my shoulder, watching my six, trying to figure out, if I'm going to
Mm,
be the next person. That is a harm, the little AJ and little Joshua created. And part of this student-led restorative practices work is we have to be accountable for that harm. And part of being accountable for it is I've got to do the work to repair the harm. And I've got to come up
mm,
with a plan for what is the harm that I've created and how will I go about repairing that in this school. The challenge is that having children not repair the harm that they've created does not teach accountability. It doesn't
yeah.
teach them to have to step forward and address the mess that they caused. I think it's a fundamental failure of so many of our schools that we take a retributive approach to discipline, where the operational concept is how do we mete out the appropriate punishment. The problem is, a lot of our kids sitting home for 5 days just means I get to level up my Fortnite character and play some Call of Duty. It doesn't
Exactly.
necessarily mean I'm gonna be sitting at home thinking about, what is the responsibility I should be taking? But if instead, forcing those students to really confront that as long as they're willing to take responsibility, forcing them to confront that their choices did create harm for themselves, for others, and for their school, and that they're going to have to be responsible for coming up with a plan to repair that harm, and that plan is going to have to be acceptable to the group of students who they're working with in this through this process. And then they're actually going to have to do the work, and they're going to be on a very specific timeline, because they're going to develop
Mm,
smart goals for here's exactly the steps I'm going to take, and here's exactly the time by when I will take these steps to repair the harm that I've created. Like this approach to discipline, where the focus, rather than on how do we mete out punishment, but rather the focus is on how do we mete out accountability, to me is a critical thing that's missing in a whole lot of places. The challenge is that all too often, even when we do take an approach like this, instead of it being student led, it'll be adult led. But then
mm,
what? But then what? The challenge with that is we've replaced a lot of the opportunity for learning and growth, a lot of the opportunity for discernment, with direction. Instead of having students figure out what is the harm I've created and how I'll repair it, adults show up and offer advice and insights on what the students should do. But the challenge is, something I learned from my brother, actually, from his time in officer training in the Marine Corps, is that advice from above is indistinguishable from a command. And so trying
mm,
to offer students advice for how to repair the harm actually robs them of creativity and thoughtfulness and being accountable, because now they're just going to implement whatever advice the adult gave them, because they're just, oh well, that's what they're telling me to do, and so that's what I'm going to do. But it doesn't actually cause me to have to sit and think through what are the repercussions of my actions, and what am I going to have to do to repair the harm that I've created. And so this idea of using these moments of um, poor judgment as a learning opportunity, and forcing a scenario where the students have an opportunity to actually be accountable for their behavior and repair what they've harmed. To me, that's an important part of the type of education that I want for children, and that I think our nation needs.
I think that is critical. Man, two things that you said in there too that I love is you mentioned SMART goals. So specific, measurable, I
That's
believe
right.
achievable, realistic, and time based. And I always add another one to that, smarts shared. Is I think once you come up with
Yeah.
that goal, share it with someone. And another one that you talked about that we do in the military is really reflecting. or an AAR, after action review
Mhm.
of, and that's the key. It's silencing your mind, taking a tactical pause, observing your surroundings, and then pursuing with purpose once you've reflected on how what went wrong and how can you become better. And it's universal. So I love that you're teaching that.
And that's exactly it. The problem is purely suspension, where just, get out of the building, we'll see you in 5 days, is
Yeah.
not an after action report. It
No.
doesn't force that tactical evaluation of what did I do that caused losing, and how do
Mm.
we lose less going forward? Instead, often what it is just reloading. Okay, well, I got 5 days to sit around and stew, and when I get back, Joshua's really going to get it. But
Yeah.
that's that isn't really creating that isn't creating a context in which folks are actually learning from whatever the experience of the moment was. It's just creating a context where they're more likely to come back and do more of the same thing that landed them in the situation to begin with.
Mm. Yeah, that's powerful, brother. So what I would love is, because everyone that comes on here has that spark, that moment that they've identified. Hey, this is the turning point in my life. I'm going to turn this pain into purpose. And when was that for you?
um, the second you asked the question, the first thing that popped in my mind was seventh grade,
Mm,
and um, the foster home that I happened to be in that year was kind of in the middle of a little rural town in the middle of Missouri, but it was not a place that was friendly to folks who looked like me.
mm,
Folks, for the most part, weren't openly hostile, but it was clear that they hadn't seen a whole lot of folks who didn't look like their families, and so I was certainly a aberration. There were definitely no other children of color in the school or in any of the schools that we played against, any of our athletic teams. I was very, very much isolated in that regard, and there were some young men at the school who made it clear that they had uh, family members who were in the Klan, and that they did not appreciate me being in
mm,
their town and in their school. Um, and they went to a physical altercation, which, because there were a group of them and just me, I lost quite quickly. And there were a series of experiences like that where, just because of the color of my skin, that I was attacked in some of those cases physically, in many cases verbally. And I absolutely hated not only the experience, but many of the people who I felt like were treating me incredibly unfairly. But at the exact same time, there was one particular student who happened to be the girlfriend of one of the young men who attacked me. And he got suspended for the rest of the semester for his role in orchestrating the attack. But she then hated me, absolutely hated me, and blamed me for being the person who caused her boyfriend to no longer be at school, and that it was somehow my fault
wow.
that he got in trouble. And I asked my foster mother what to do about this, because I didn't know what to do. I've never had a situation like this. And she said, "Well, you're just going to have to kill her with kindness." I was
Mm.
like, "I don't know what that means, but that sounds really dumb." But I said, "Okay, well, I'll try it out." And so each
Yeah.
day I'd go to school, and I'd wave at her, and I'd say hi, and
Mm.
ask her how she's doing, and she just give me this evil, evil look and say something hateful and walk away. And the next day I'd try to be kind some more, and I get the evil look, and every day I'd go home, it's like I try to be nice to her. It's like, well, you just got to kill her with kindness again tomorrow. And after a few months, it got to the point where something just clicked, something happened, and we wound up being really, really good friends. And we'd sit together at lunch and we'd talk, and we just really came to connect. Well, the following semester, her boyfriend comes back to the school, and his plan is to immediately come and deal with me because
Mm,
it's still they don't want somebody who looks like me, in their school. And she stands in front of me. She's like, you're gonna leave him alone, and you're gonna let him finish up this year at school, and you're gonna finish up, and you're gonna be over there, but you're never gonna touch him again." And she told him that's the way it was gonna be, and he couldn't believe his ears. He turned around and never messed with me again. I have not thought about her in probably a decade or two. But when you ask the question, kind of what was something pivotal in my journey, particularly around education, for some reason that moment came flooding back. And I seriously, like, I can't even think how long it's been since I've thought of this story. But that inside of some of the most despicable and um, intentionally harmful hate that I've ever experienced in my life, being at the center of a hate crime for no other reason than because of the color of my skin. That even in that moment, um, um, the kindness won out in a relationship in a way that wound up being a protective factor for me. Obviously it wasn't calculated for that purpose. Um, but even though I still harbored a lot of anger and hatred, and it was probably a number of years before I trusted or would have anything to do with white people after that. But
well,
but I never stopped being moved by the impact of my repeated deployment of kindness, even in the face of hatred, the transformative impact it had in a relationship, and the protective effect that that relationship had for me for the remainder of that year. And unfortunately, after that year, I was promptly removed. That was obviously an inappropriate um, placement, an inappropriate place for me to be. But that particular lesson re- resonates so much that that's the first thing that popped in my mind when you asked.
mm. Man, it's such a powerful story, and first of all, I'm sorry that you had to go through that. To me, that just it blows my mind. I've been raised in rural West Virginia, and never raised to see race is a divider. Never knew about that really until I grew up, unfortunately, and was more exposed to the world. And I credit my father in the way that I was raised, because he's such a good man, someone that I genuinely want to be like and emulate as I continue to get older. But being able to turn that deep pain into to purposes, it's powerful, and I can understand having that kind of hate, at least in Afghanistan, kind of looking at people who just shot at you, and then you have to put on a
Mhm,
smile and talk to them, but killing them with kindness. And I think that's what separated me from a lot of my peers in Afghanistan, to the point where other Afghan partners wouldn't want to work with some of my peers, because I
mhm,
sat down with them, I was intentional with them, and I tried to assimilate as much as I possibly could, because I'm in your country. You're not in my country, and
right.
I had that kind of mindset. You reminded me of a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort,
Moments of
but
Yep,
where he
right.
stands at times of challenges and
Yep.
controversy. And that story just popped in my head, that quote.
No, it's a absolutely. I've always enjoyed that one by King. This this idea of I'm in someone else's country, they're not in mine, for this, particular place. There, it should clarify at that particular time. I'm sure it's not like this anymore, and certainly hope not. But you know, folks would talk about the Klan the way
Mm,
people would talk about a slightly disreputable Rotary Club or something of that nature. Like it wasn't something that was considered dishonorable to
It's
be part of.
crazy.
Well, those are just good old boys. They're just doing what they do, that type of thing. But it's such a radically different place. Certainly, unlike any other placement foster placement I'd ever had. Um, but this idea of kind of being a stranger in a very strange land and trying to figure out how do I still live out this value of kindness and humanity, even in the face of that. It's um, I I don't at all equate my experience with yours, but I definitely can imagine how that would be a really challenging thing to do, and a real test of your particular character and who you were trying to be, even literally in your context in a war zone.
Yeah. Yeah. It's still, man, that's a powerful story. And it kind of leads me, I think, into a great question is what leadership lessons have you taken from your past that you're now transferring and applying to your current leadership roles?
One of the things that I try to adhere to, I don't know how successful it is. I definitely teach it, so I hope I'm living it. I hope I'm out here living it. I guess some of my team members, yeah, uh, who listen to your podcast, will find out what they think about it. But something I definitely preach about is this idea of parallel process, that whatever the leader's doing, that it's reasonable to
Mm,
expect that the followers will be taking cue from that. And so if I want folks to march to the left, I should probably march off to the left. If I want people to march to the right, I should probably march to the right. But marching to the left and telling people to go right probably just ain't gonna work out. That whatever behaviors that I want to see in the world around me, my first access to leadership that causes that is by demonstrating that in my own behavior. Simply put, leading by example. But the way that I describe it in my trainings is parallel process. That whatever the leader is doing, you should reasonably expect that the followers will silently be taking their cues from that. In the education context, the way that most commonly comes up is that tell school boards whatever it is that you want folks in the school system to be focused on during our school board meetings that are usually open to the public. We've got to make sure that we're spending uh, the bulk of our time focused on the things that we say matter most. That if
mm,
we say ABC matters the most, but we spend all of our time in these public meetings on X, Y, and Z, then what people will take from that is X, Y, and Z what matters most. And this is a fundamental failure of leadership in school boards, is that we'll spend all of our time talking about the colors of the football uniforms, and should we have tacos on Tuesday or Thursday, and should we have this book or that book, and should this person get the pencil contract, and who's going to get the toilet paper contract, and did Miss Johnson get a job, and did Mr. Jackson get a job? But the purpose of a school system is to educate children. When are we going to talk about have we actually accomplished the function of children educating? When are we going to talk about is little AJ better able to solve problems and collaborate and think critically? Is little Joshua better able to read, write, and do math? When are we having that conversation? But that if
yeah.
we don't spend uh, preponderance of our time actually focusing on our students learning, that the message that we send is that that's not what matters most. And folks in the school system will parallel that. They will follow our leadership as school board members. And if we don't make the main thing, then neither will they. The phenomenon of parallel process will lead them to attend to what we are attending to, not to what we tell them to attend to.
I had General Petraeus on a couple of days ago, and he really blew my mind with how he defined leadership. But it's kind of like setting a vision is at a very high strategic level. How do you define your leadership? It's coming up with big ideas, that your vision of what you want to do, communicating that, replicating that within the organization, and then continuously refining it, just kind of going through it. And as you were talking, you reminded me of one of the rules of leadership that I've identified as the rule of mirrors, and it's aligning our actions and then modeling the way for others, with our deeds and our words. And I've had a boss tell me, deeds, not words. You can say all the right things, but if you're not following through with the right actions, and they're not aligned with the standards that you said, the values that you placed, then no one else is going to replicate that, because your organization, your students, the teachers, whoever is in the school is literally just a mirror image of the culture that you're setting at the top, as a school board member. So
Right.
that's beautifully said. So I'd love to kind of go on where you currently are right now, on your journey. And I know you just recently released a book. I think it was called "Great on Their Behalf." What
Mhm.
inspired you to write that?
Um, I can say two things. One, a bunch of people said, "We'd like to have access to your ideas without having to put up with talking to you. So can you please write them down so we can easily get a hold of those things?" And I had to call you about it. I consider that a more than reasonable request, because there's a lot of days I don't want to fool with me either. So I understand that. So that's definitely one thing, is just trying to make it accessible to folks on their terms, when it's convenient for them. But then my kind of selfish aspiration in this is to, we've got about 14,000 school districts across the country. And
Mm,
that means we got about 14,000 school boards. And from my team's observation is we watch school boards constantly from all across the country, and we code them. We have a coding instrument where we actually analyze the meetings to try to identify what percentage of the board's time was focused on children actually learning and that which matters most, versus what percentage of the board's time was focused on all the other things, all the other kind of adult matters and adult preferences and adult desires and adult interest, versus how much of the time was focused on student outcomes. And what's become incredibly apparent to us is across the 14,000 school districts nationwide, there's an epidemic of a focus on adult inputs, to the exclusion of a focus on student outcomes. We're not focused on our children learning. We're focused on all the stuff that adults are doing.
mm,
Now, you can't ignore the stuff that adults are doing, but at some point, you do in fact have the conversation: is the stuff that adults are doing actually creating the results that, that we want in the lives of our children? And that conversation is simply lacking. And so the second reason that I'd cite for the writing of the book is to help accelerate the transition of school boards away from being adult input focused to being student outcomes focused, towards away from focus on all the things that adults are doing, and toward the primary lens for the work of school boards being: what is it that our students know and are able to do? How do we know that they've grown in that area? And how are we responding to what we know?
uh, could you walk me through the book, and maybe what is one piece of advice that could be potentially universal to anyone
Yeah.
in their leadership journey?
Well, so interestingly enough, the bulk of the book focuses on a continuous improvement cycle that school board members can engage in, that school boards can engage in, to really drive this focus on improving student outcomes. But to your point, it's not horribly specific to school boards. So the
Mm,
5 steps of this continuous improvement cycle are: first, get your mindset focused. What is the actual hill that we are here to climb? What is the duty that we are here to accomplish? Is it about student outcomes, or isn't it? And so the first step is to get a focused mindset. The second step is, in the context of a focused mindset, is to then clarify the priorities. What are the
mm,
specific SMART goals that we are here to accomplish? Write them down, make them plain. Don't have it be ambiguous. Don't have anybody question, what does winning look like? What is the exact measure of whether we were successful at the task or we were not successful at the task? The second step is clarify the priorities. You have to write them down and make them plain. The third step is you have to monitor the progress. Are we actually getting closer to the top of this hill, or are we not? what are the things that we've said we're trying to accomplish, and how exactly are we measuring whether we're getting closer to them or further away from them. So the third step is you got to measure progress. You've got to constantly be looking at, are we actually getting closer, or are we getting further away, and what pivots are we making based on what that data is telling us.
Mhm.
The fourth step is then align the resources. Once we have a sense of whether we're getting closer to the top of the hill or further from the top of the hill, then whatever other resources we have, we need to figure out how are we going to deploy those in a way that honors what the information is telling us about where we are relative to the objective. And so the third is, all about alignment of resources, that they're actually aligned with accomplishment of the priorities. And then the fifth one is just communicating the results. It's
Mhm.
not helpful to the team if the team doesn't know exactly where we're at, what we're doing, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what we're going to pivot to do next, and how we're realigning the resources to accomplish that. If we're not actively and repetitively communicating that, then folks don't know what to do and how they can play a role in the greatness of our children. And so those are the 5 steps in the continuous improvement cycle I put in the book for school boards. Again, it's to uh, focus mindset, clarify the priorities, monitor progress, align resources, and then communicate the results. And then just keeping that cycle over and over again until we get to the top of the hill, until we've actually improved outcomes for our students. But again, to your point, there's nothing particularly unique to school systems. Like,
Mm.
these are some basic practices that I suspect are going to play well in almost any environment where performance matters.
Any organization. Any organization, and even personal, in your life, if you follow those 5 steps, you're gonna see growth. That is powerful, and I go back to something you said just a little bit ago, is that people wanted you to write the book so they didn't have to talk to you. I think it's an absolute honor and a privilege to talk to you. You have a smooth voice, and you're directly to the point. Like, I don't know, I don't see that. And there was another thing that you said too, selfish admiration. Kind of watching all these different school boards, like over 14,000. The first thing that my mind went to, it's not selfish, it's selfless, because you're trying to make a world a better place. You're trying to bring light to this world. And that is a selfless act. Another example of a true servant leader. So thank you. The next question I would love is, this isn't your first book that you've written, and as a part of, you also wrote, I think, on leadership was part of that. I
That's
think,
correct.
and you're getting ready to write another book or be a part of. Is it called Rogue School Board Members Handbook?
Yeah. So the Rogue Board Members Handbook is actually already written, but I released Great on Their Behalf first, and now I'll go back and do some revisions to the Rogue School Board Members Handbook. But where Great on Their Behalf is really, how do we function as a unit? How do we be great as a team, as a school board, as
Mm,
a unit? The Rogue Board Members Handbook is much more tailored toward an individual board member who finds themselves somewhat at odds with the rest of their colleagues, and trying to figure out how they can be impactful even when they perhaps see the world differently than the rest of the people on their board. What are the options available to them to still make a difference in the lives of children, even if it's, a lot of these school boards are, 7-member school boards. So what if 6 people see things one way and you see it differently? Like, what are your options when you're still the rogue school board member? And then there was a large collection of chapters put together in a book called On Leadership, that looked at leadership from a variety of perspectives. And
mm.
I really enjoyed that because it was such a diversity of voices about what leadership looks like. But my particular contribution to the book was leadership from the perspective of K-12 institutions.
I really, really want to dig into that book, and I find it fascinating is that it's a multifaceted book on leadership, because leadership's not just universal to one set. Like, I view leadership as inspiring, purpose, direction, and motivation. If I can do that, provide purpose, direction, and motivation, then I'm going to inspire you to get results, and aligning my values and modeling the way. But it's not universal just to me. That's my definition of
Yeah.
leadership that was forged through the military. And that's why I love having conversations, especially with people selfishly. outside of the military because I love hearing other people's perspectives on what has made them successful. Because I'll be honest with you, AJ, civilian life is fascinating to me. I guess all I've ever known is the military.
I know my brother still, even though he's been out of the Corps for 2 years, is a colonel. He spent, the previous 20, and he still feels like a little bit of a fish out of water some days.
Yeah, that's funny. So the next question I'd love to take it to is some of the challenges, that I see right now within school boards, and I'm curious on what your perspective is. So I was really thinking about this today because I have a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old, and the three things that keep me up at night about schools is security, first and foremost.
Mhm.
And I always put myself in the mindset as like, if something were to happen at my child's school, you know, how would I react to that?
Yeah,
First is like I would just run in if I could, but I know that I wouldn't probably have the time to do that.
yeah,
Second is the cultural changes that was going and taking place right now, like the speed of which the social media and the attention span that it's draining from the kids. I think it's a unique time to be alive, especially with Chat GPT and like
yeah.
all these things that I wish I would have had secretively.
No doubt, no doubt.
And then the final one is I think hiring talent.
Yeah,
Um, because if you can't align the resources, what you were saying in one of your top five, then it doesn't matter who you have. I think you have to have the right person for the job because they may not be skilled. And I learned this in the military. They may not know what you're wanting them to do, but if you can hire based on cultural fit, character, values, you can teach them
mhm,
to be exceptional, but you have to hire for culture first. And those are like the three big problem sets that it kept
yeah.
running through my mind. And I'm curious to get your perspective.
Yeah, so certainly these are challenges that are vexing school systems and school system leaders across the country. First on the safety thing, the number one job of the school system is to educate children. But if children aren't safe, education ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
And so that there are prerequisites that absolutely have to be in place. I describe it that way because I've certainly seen communities and have served and supported communities that have dealt with real tragedy and have
Mm,
lost children to violence. And it can be really easy sometimes to make conversation about safety the only conversation that anybody wants
yeah.
to have, especially when you lose a child. That's a different kind of pain. That's a different kind of hurt. And so it becomes easy for that to be the center of everything. The challenge I'd submit to folks is you have to attend to safety. If people can't trust that their children are going to be well cared for, they're going to find another place for their children to be,
Yeah.
and that is a sacred obligation of parents everywhere. And so you've got to address that. But I'd also say you've got to make sure that you still keep safety or keep education at the forefront.
Mm,
That you have to have both. It can't be allowed to be an either or. We can't sacrifice educating children because we're trying to protect. Like if we, you know, wrap them all in bubble wrap and toss them in a dark closet and closed and padlock the door, we'd probably keep them safe. I don't know they'd be learning much. And
yeah.
so trying to figure out how do we balance that and making sure that we are making the main thing, our children actually being educated at the same time that we are attending to how are we creating as safe of environment as possible. Now, when it comes to safety, a few things come to mind. One, are we creating an environment where we have clarity and insight into what's going on with our students and when they're really suffering and when they're really struggling?
Mm,
And what we've seen is that students who are struggling in intense ways, that the quicker that we can discern those things, the quicker that we can intervene and try to get them the support that they need Like, that's become a real burden that a lot of school systems have taken on of trying to figure out, how do we know that? What are the early warning signs? What are the ways that we'll know when students are struggling to the point where, they may be considering harm to themselves or harm to others? One of the things that you see a lot of folks lean into, and I understand why they do, and I think there's some necessity here, but I think it also probably gets more attention than the first one, which I think should get the most attention, is how are our children actually doing. But the other thing that you hear folks talk a lot about with safety is hardening of facilities.
Yeah.
That's I'm not opposed to that, but if we have facilities that are perfectly hardened, but our children are still struggling and suffering, then I don't know that any amount of hardening is going to carry the day. And so I think there's a
Yeah.
reasonable amount that has to be done as a protective measure that is reasonable and appropriate to do. But I wouldn't let that overshadow our obligation to be really mindful about what is going on with our students. When do they need us, and how do we have early warning, early indication that they need us, and then how are we having systems that are built to be responsive to that, so that
Mm.
the those needs of our children don't go unaddressed, that they don't escape our attention. Those are some thoughts about what I see school systems doing nationwide that seems to really be positioning them to create safe learning environments for all children. Just as one side note, I don't think putting a gun in the hand of every single teacher is a good plan. Um,
Agree.
I I want people who are extraordinarily well trained in how
Yeah.
to retain a firearm and how to use a firearm and when to use and when not to use a firearm. Those are the folks that I would want to have a firearm in a school building. But I don't want any and everybody who happens to be in that building to be armed. That I don't believe that is the solution. Some folks do. I understand that. I think that's going to backfire on us pretty heavily. Like that's
Yeah.
a I would prefer a sworn officer, somebody who's actually had the appropriate training. The idea that a concealed carry license permit is adequate firearms training, I think, is foolishness to anybody who actually has a concealed carry permit and knows how low of a
Yeah.
bar that is
Right.
relative to what sworn officers actually go through. So those are some thoughts about safety. In terms of some of the technology challenges, you're not wrong. The issues around social media and the bullying that children are experiencing, that
Mm.
part, I think, of the challenge of that is that it is a world in which you and I are merely immigrants. That
Yes.
our children, digital natives who have grown up in this territory, and it is, part of their social DNA. And you and I are just learning about it after the fact. It is not a part of our social DNA yet. We come
Mm.
to it trying to understand it, and so there are things that I think it's always going to be hard for us not to miss. Things that'll always be
Yeah.
hard for us to catch. That's part of what makes it such a difficult thing. Um, so, for example, taking children's phones away from them. A lot of adults don't seem to understand why this seems to be a debilitatingly traumatizing event for children. It's like it's just a device. Like it's like if I took your car keys away, it's not like I took your legs away. But for a lot of kids, you take their phone away, it is like you took an extension of their personality and their
Mm.
form of personal expression away. It's not just like you removed a device; it's like the device has become a part of them in this kind of cyborg, manner. And so just recognizing that is a phenomenon that did not exist a couple generations ago. And I think as an education system, we're still trying to figure out, okay, what does all this mean and how do we respond to it? For my part, one of the things I've enjoyed about teaching student-led restorative practices is that having students lead a lot of these conversations when students engage in like cyberbullying, having students be a critical part of leading those conversations. I have learned so much by hearing their conversations, their discussions around what behavior is appropriate and inappropriate, and what is the accountability systems that they're putting in place for their peers. I have learned so much from listening to those conversations because they're talking about stuff that I would never have thought to talk about. And so,
Mm.
one thing that I would encourage the folks who are also struggling with that across the country is, do what I've done on this. create a context in which you can actually listen to students talk through these issues, listen to students coach each other and counsel each other through these issues. I guarantee you're going to learn some stuff and some perspectives that probably would have never occurred to you, just like they would have never occurred to me. And
Oh
that can
wow.
be the basis of that could be the basis of beginning to find solutions in your community by hearing what some of our digital natives, by hearing, what are the solutions our students would come up with. And then you had a third topic. I completely missed it.
So hiring for talent
Oh,
and
yeah. So just real quick on hiring. There, the I have personally observed teachers take a multi-thousand-dollar pay cut to get away from a incompetent and toxic principal and work
mm,
environment. And so if there's any coaching I got for folks, step one, honor our teachers, give them a working environment where has a psychological safety in place where they can actually be the strongest expression of their leadership in their classroom. When teachers have to simultaneously figure out how to be great for 30 kids in a classroom and deal with a toxic adult environment, that is the recipe for burnout.
yeah.
Um, Inside of the toxicity that teachers have experienced throughout the course of the pandemic and kind of the horribleness of school from via Zoom, which is just, I think, it's been demonstrably not a quality experience either for students or for adults. Like that is not the default that we want to ever be in. But there's a lot of stress and a lot of challenge that's created for teachers. And I think the more we can do to kind of de-stress and detoxify the working conditions that our teachers are operating under, I think the greater the chance that we'll be able to retain it. Because I don't actually, for me, the alarm bells aren't around hiring teachers. For me, a lot of the alarm bells are around retaining teachers in the profession. There are just a lot of folks who are coming in, they're getting a taste, and then they are going out. And
Yeah.
if we were able to really retain those folks and create for them the winning conditions necessary to really experience the joy of effectively serving children, like
Mm,
once you've once you've gotten a taste of that and you've got an environment where you can reproduce that, I don't see people running away from that. What I see
no.
people running away from is toxic work environments where they can't do what's on their heart to do for children, that they can't be of service in the ways that they really feel called to be of service. And in the context of that, folks are looking for someplace else to be.
That I never thought about that until you said it, is that we're not setting up teachers culturally at the top for success. And I go back in time of thinking what were some of the best memories that I had of being an officer and a commander. It's when soldiers come back to me and tell me, hey, this word that you told me, or the help that you provided has led to this point, and just seeing
Yeah.
growth. That's the best feeling that I could ever have in
Hmm.
the world. And what is it, like a serotonin, like,
Yeah.
spike? It's the leadership chemical that Simon Sinek talks about in the book Leaders Eat Last. That is why I love doing what I do. And yeah, I never thought about that. That's amazing. So, last question before we get to the final show segment,
Mhm.
and I think this will really sum up the podcast well, is what is the most important lesson you've learned so far throughout your leadership career that you want new education professionals to have?
Yeah, it's probably that the a combination of the first and second items in the book of a focused mindset and
Mm,
clarifying the priorities. If I had to kind of think of an amalgam of the two, is just getting really clear about what we're here to accomplish. Like, I just feel like
mm,
so often time gets wasted, energy gets wasted, resources gets wasted because we haven't started by getting crystal clear about what is the hill we're here to conquer. Like, what is the exact point? How will we know what winning? How do we know what success is? Can we get crystal clear about what it is it that we will sacrifice other things for. So often, I think one of the things that annoys a lot of folks in the education world is when it seems like we're just jumping from good idea to good idea to good idea,
Yeah.
just some new shiny thing every day. And I think I think having a unshakable clarity about what matters most, one of the things that it gives us is the ability to say no to stuff that are okay ideas, but they aren't laser focused on accomplishment of the
Mm,
mission. And that, in fact, I suggest to folks that that is one of the ways that you know that you are fully dialed in, when you can easily say no to really good ideas, not because they're bad ideas, but because they're just not perfectly in alignment with where we're headed.
that's an amazing answer. Yeah, absolutely amazing answer. So, final show segment. I call it the killer bees. You'll probably enjoy
Yeah,
that. So, be brief, be brilliant, be present, and be gone. It's the same 4 questions I ask everyone on Tales of Leadership. If you're ready, we'll
let's
start.
get it.
So, what do you believe separates a good leader from an extraordinary leader?
Humility.
Question 2. What is one resource you could recommend to our listeners now?
New book out by Doug Lamov, The Coach's Guide to Teaching. Just a
Mm,
brilliant series of insights into the neurological research around effective coaching. Just a really fascinating read.
I look forward to that one. So, question 3. If you could go back in time and give AJ, younger AJ, a piece of advice, what would it be?
Go faster, go harder.
Oh, I love that one. That's a good answer. All right. So, final question. So, how can our listeners find you and how can they add value to your mission?
The thing that I most want, as I described earlier, is I really want to accelerate this transition from an adult inputs focused worldview, the status quo approach to school board governance, to a student outcomes focus, to
Mm,
where we are intensely focused, obsessively focused on, are we actually producing in reality the types of increases in what students know and are able to do, that is the whole reason the school system exists. And so, inside of that, 2 things. One, if that's a conversation people are curious about, feel free to contact me. You just go to ajcrabill.com, ajcrabill.com, and folks can contact me if they want to talk about that specifically. But also, if folks feel a real call on their life to be a part of accelerating that transition, the single biggest thing that I need right now is just more folks who are willing to step in the role of coach, more
mm,
folks who are willing to take on this work and help me reach the 14,000 school districts, across school boards across the country. Right now, I can measure the number of certified coaches that I have doing this work in the dozens. And really, I need to be measuring that in the hundreds so that we can
yeah.
actually reach all of the students all across the country, regardless of which school board that they're served by.
Yeah, that's amazing and it's inspiring. AJ, this has been an amazing podcast. Thank you for being intentional with me, especially like late at night. The world keeps going. We started filming this at 9 o'clock. It's probably 10. I haven't even looked at the clock because I'm depressed now.
No, it's been a great
Uh,
conversation. I've loved it.
have a great night, brother. Thank you again.
Be blessed. Thank you.